This video began as an idea just to go out and document somewhere a bit different, somewhere that wasn't in my local area. And I happened to be in Ormskirk one day, so I went on to Our Lady's Roman Catholic Church on the corner of Southport Road and Hall Lane in Lydiate. Mainly because it's got a connection to my family. There are a lot of my relatives buried there. And there, on my last visit, I found a grave that I hadn't noticed before, but it reminded me of the story I'd read about my great-granddad's cousin. It isn't a joyful story. I think I should say that now. And before I even go any further, I am going to tell you that it does involve death. A few descriptions from newspapers of the time that it was thought appropriate to put into print in the 1890s. If that is something that you don't particularly want to hear at the moment, I completely understand. This story does not involve anybody rich or powerful or famous, but what I think this story does prove is that you can actually learn quite a lot about the world that your ancestors knew if you only start to look beyond the census returns. On Friday the 17th of March 1949, an obituary was printed in the Ormskirk Advertiser. Richard William Liptrot, a member of an old Lydiate family, had died a week earlier. He was only 58 years old. And his funeral was held at Our Lady's Catholic Church on Tuesday the 14th of March. Richard was unmarried and had lived with his sister at 36 Willow Hay in Maghull, which is not far away. For those who don't know the area, we're on what is now the Lancashire-Merseyside border. Merseyside didn't exist in the 40s. Lydiate is about 5 miles southwest of Ormskirk, and Willow Hay still exists. It's a residential street somewhere between the A59 and the M58 motorway. Richard was said to be the son of the late Mr. John Liptrot, who formerly carried on business as a baker. And Richard had been born on the 10th of February 1891, which makes him 7 weeks old when the census was taken that year. So of course he was listed on it. Notice the following extract, because it includes a reference to Richard's uncle, another Richard Liptrot. "20 years later, Richard was still at home with his parents. There were also 3 younger sisters in the house and a domestic servant from Liverpool. Home for Richard and his family was a 10-room house at Canal Bank on Fir Grove Lane in Lydiate. His father John kept a baker's shop, and Richard and his 17-year-old sister Mary were the shop assistants. The census also shows that Richard's mother Mary had actually given birth to 6 children, but only 4 were living. William, or Willie, died in 1894, Winifred in 1900, so both in infancy. At this point, you're probably wondering, why should you continue this video? Have I told you anything interesting enough to make it worth your time? But the clue is in the detail that Mary Liptrot had 6 children. Her son William, Willie, and her brother-in-law Richard, who had been living with her and her husband in 1891, both died on the same morning as my great-granddad's cousin, Margaret Whalley. And everything that I'm about to tell you comes back to Our Lady's Church on Hall Lane in Lydiate. I suppose the story really begins on the 13th of April 1843, when my great-great-grandmother, Anne Woodcock, was born in Lydiate. In January 1870, aged 26, Anne married my slightly younger great-great-grandfather, John Hurst, at Our Lady's Church. 2.5 years later, Anne's younger sister Margaret married Thomas Whalley, a farm labourer from the nearby village of Halsall. But this time, there was a certain urgency involved, because Margaret was pregnant. And on the 16th of September 1872, her baby girl was born, also in Lydiate. 2 days later, the little girl is christened Margaret. Again, the ceremony takes place at Our Lady's Church. Baby Margaret would become the eldest of 7 children. She was 13 when her brother William was born at Poplar Farm in the hamlet of Haskane, about 2 miles north of Lydiate, on the 9th of May 1886. But the next baby came along on the 19th of January 1888, not quite 2 years later. This one was another boy named Peter, but this time his mother, Margaret, then aged 42, was not so lucky. She would only survive for another 34 days, and she too was buried at Our Lady's Church. When I first discovered this family connection, my instinct, of course, was to trace all of those Whalley children. And up until 1891, it was easy enough. The widowed Thomas Whalley stayed in Haskane, employed as an agricultural farm labourer with 5 of his children still at home, including teenager Margaret. But on the 16th of September 1892, which happened to be Margaret's 20th birthday, her younger brother John died, aged 16. She's 20 years old. She's already lost her mother and 2 of her brothers. But after that, things grew misty. On census night in 1901, Margaret should have been 26 and a half. I naturally imagined that she must have got married, but I couldn't find her. I ended up searching the British newspaper archives. I can't remember what I was looking for. I must have tried the words Whalley and Lydiate, and I found a match in the Manchester Courier, dated the 26th of April, 1894. And that was how I learnt that Margaret Whalley, my great-granddad's cousin, was with John and Mary Liptrot's second child, William, when he died. By April 1894, Margaret Whalley was working in Lydiate. John and Mary Liptrot employed her as a nursemaid, with just cause, I think. They had 3 children. She lived with them at their house next door to John's provision shop, not far from the wharf on the Leeds and Liverpool Canal. The building was apparently 3 stories high, and it was also insured, although the stock inside was not. And on the night of Tuesday the 24th of April, 9 people went to bed, as usual, in the Liptrot house. The Manchester Courier's account suggests that at 12:50 on Wednesday morning, a fire broke out in the Liptrots' house. The Exeter and Plymouth Gazette, the Newcastle Journal and the Irish Independent were just 3 of the newspapers to publish the words, "The fire is supposed to have been caused by a cinder falling on the hearthrug." But from here, the story differs slightly. The Newcastle Journal and the Irish Independent actually printed identical reports, suggesting that they were forwarded perhaps by a news agency. And they understood that at 1 a.m, Mary Liptrot, who, as we remember, had a relatively new baby, was in bed when she heard a cracking sound. So she got up. She went to the top of the stairs, only to be driven back by dense clouds of smoke, and naturally she raised an alarm. But the Manchester Courier begs to differ. That paper says that it was Mary's sister Catherine, Kate Pope, who got up after hearing a strange noise to find the bottom of the staircase in flames. And the little detail that follows makes me want to believe the Manchester papers. Also, it's the Courier that tells us what Catherine did next. She immediately proceeded to the bedroom of the servant, Margaret Whalley, with whom was sleeping Willie Liptrot, the toddler. Margaret stopped to dress herself. Perhaps that sounds like a strange reaction if you've just been told that the house is on fire. Maybe it's understandable in the context of the time that she was living in. It is just past midnight on an April morning in Lancashire. She's an unmarried 21-year-old Catholic girl. She's living in a house which she knows contains 3 adult men. And it's 1894. I understand why she got dressed, to preserve her modesty a little bit. So Kate Pope then goes to another bedroom, where William and Richard Liptrot, her brother-in-law's brothers, were fast asleep. They turned over and said, "What's the matter, Kate?" She replied, "The house is on fire, get up, quick." So by now the house is all smoke and flames. And Kate Pope went downstairs, where the lino, and the sofa is blazing. Her face and other parts of the body were burnt. Fortunately, her sister Mary, her brother-in-law John, are already awake, and they follow Kate downstairs, outside, with their children, Richard and baby Mary. The timings are a bit vague at this point in the newspaper report. Perhaps it's between 1:15 and 1:30. 9 people were sleeping in the house that night. 6 adults, aged 21 to 35, none of them particularly old, and 3 children, all under 4 years. Of these, 3 adults and 2 children have got out of the building. 3 adults and 1 child are still inside. Somewhere before 2 o'clock in the morning, the servant Whalley was seen at the bedroom window with the baby in her arms. The flames had by this time brought a considerable number of people to the scene. So this fire has become serious enough and bright enough to catch the attention of the nearby residents, the neighbours, who would have been in bed because it's the middle of the night. They've probably got up, looked out of their window, and bothered to get dressed and go down to try and investigate. Perhaps they even want to assist in putting out the fire. And these shouted to Whalley to jump for her life. She appeared to hesitate, and then fell back into the smoke and the flames, perishing with the baby. Now, I'm no scientist, not even good at biology, but if that building was as smoky as the newspapers suggest, then I sort of want to believe that both of them suffocated before anything else happened. You'd like to think so. I've already shown you that this incident was widely reported in the newspapers, not just those in the Ormskirk area, not just those in Lancashire. It turned up in newspapers across the country, and even over the Irish Sea, but not the least of the papers to report it was, of course, the local paper, the Ormskirk Advertiser. The edition dated the 3rd of May 1894 is very clear that the incident was discussed at the local Board of Health meeting on the evening of Friday the 27th of April, so this is in the immediate aftermath. Their account of what happened at this meeting is so detailed that you can actually plot the local fire brigade being summoned in 30-minute intervals. You might be surprised by that, but indeed towns did have fire brigades at this point in history. Some of them were fully paid up firemen. Some of them were assisted by volunteers. And what is more fortunate, if there is a fortunate side to this story, is that this event, this incident, took place in 1894 after the invention of the telephone. So at 1:43 a.m, a police officer was actually able to phone Richard Carruthers Ivy, the 33-year-old surveyor of the Ormskirk Board of Health, to let him know that a fire had broken out in Maghull. Maghull neighbours Lydiate, and Bell's Lane, where the fire broke out, is actually near the Lydiate-Maghull boundaries, so I will allow them some room for error there. And within 12 minutes, Ormskirk's 12-man fire brigade have sprung into action. They are waiting in Church Street in the centre of the town. 3 of them, Patrick Naylis, John Wilson and Thomas Walsh, are the volunteers. But they've still got to wait. They need the horse-drawn fire engine, and they need the horses too. To bring in the Manchester Courier's account, what is tragic about this timing, remember this is 1:43 a.m. that the fire brigade have been alerted in Ormskirk, is that it was about 2 a.m. when the observers of Lydiate see the remains of baby William Liptrot fall through the ruined house. That's what state the house was in. Right down through into the cellar, which was under the shop. And they understood that Margaret died holding the baby to her breast, which is probably instinctive. There's a sort of protective instinct there, I think, to look after the child in your charge. And somewhere in the crowd, of course, John and Mary Liptrot, and their 3-year-old and their newborn and Mary's sister Kate might have been there. I almost hope they were too distraught and frantic to realise that if they did see that, to know that it was Margaret and baby William, because it's something you wouldn't want to have to remember. At 2:22 a.m, the fire brigade finally passed Ormskirk Clock Tower, which suggests that they probably turned right out of Church Street, went down Autumn Street, on towards what we now call the A59. Within 10 minutes, those outside the Liptrot house saw Margaret's remains follow her little companion, and she too fell into the cellar. The fire brigade arrived at 2:50 in the morning, having taken exactly 28 minutes to cover the distance, over 4 miles, which sounds ludicrously slow in the year 2023. It's almost 9 miles an hour, not quite. But for an unspecified number of horses pulling a fire engine that who knows how much a late Victorian fire engine weighs, and 12 adult men in the dark with no street lights, maybe it's more impressive than we actually realise. In a minute and a half, 2 jets of water are being directed at the fire. The surveyor finds Police Sergeant Thomas and 2 other members of the county constabulary there at the scene already, and only then does he learn that there are 4 people still inside the burning building. Richard Ivy would later ask Police Sergeant Thomas a really simple question. Why hadn't the warning been given earlier? Sergeant Thomas replied that he did telephone Ormskirk's police station, but no one answered. It was the middle of the night. And eventually he just had to return to the fire, leaving the telephone in the charge of his wife, to quote the newspaper. It was over half an hour before Mrs. Thomas was able to get through to the police office. At 3:05 a.m, Sergeant Johnson and Richard Ivy found baby Willie Liptrot in the cellar under the shop. They moved him to an outbuilding. Margaret Whalley was found under 2 feet of burning debris. Firemen Wignall, Griffiths and Lloyd worked with Sergeant Johnson to recover her. They wrapped her in sacking, something that likely would be lying around in a provision dealer's shop, and she was moved to the granary. Again, if there's a granary, that's saying that there are going to be sacks to put grain in. A ladder was put up against the window of the room over the cellar, and presumably it was Sergeant Johnson who climbed it, and he was able to locate one of the Liptrot brothers near the window. They didn't actually know which one it was. So it seems that either Richard or William had maybe tried to escape, or maybe tried to get to the window for some air. Richard Ivy and Patrick Naylis, a volunteer, went up with Sergeant Johnson. And Mr. Ivy put a layer of some kind around Naylis before letting him carry on. He would not have had any protective clothing in the sense that we do now. That was the best they could do. And Sergeant Johnson took the remains down the ladder, an incredibly brave and delicate job, especially in the dark, and the unknown person was moved to the granary. And of course the building is still burning. Mr. Ivy added that the floor of the shop was now rapidly giving way. He did not have a lot of time to work with here. But fortunately, the last victim, the other brother, was found, put into a sack and taken to the granary with the others, which is sort of acting as a makeshift morgue, if anything. When all this had been heard, the chairman of the meeting offered a hearty vote of thanks to the fire brigade, which was seconded by Mr. Easton. Richard Ivy remarked that I cannot speak too highly of the conduct of the members of the brigade, and also of Patrick Naylis, John Wilson and Thomas Walsh, the 3 volunteers taken with the brigade. And I absolutely agree. We are talking about firefighters and volunteer firefighters who didn't have breathing apparatus, goggles, helmets, anything like the safety equipment that we'd use today. 3 of them aren't even professional firemen. They are incredibly brave men, were incredibly brave men, working in the hours before dawn in this smoky, burning building that they've never been inside before, and it's obvious from the newspaper reports that it was slowly collapsing around them. It is terrifying and absolutely heroic all at the same time. Torrential rain fell at Lydiate on the afternoon of Friday the 27th of April 1894. Liverpool-born Father Edward Powell, aged 53, the parish priest at Our Lady's Church, had the sad duty of conducting 4 funerals that day. 2 hearses were sent by Messrs Maguire of Liverpool. John and Mary Liptrot no longer had a house for the funeral procession to depart from, so the cortege actually began from the Running Horses pub, which is a short distance away. By 1891, Mary Liptrot's parents, Richard and Mary Pope, were living at Sandy Lane Farm in Lydiate, and the Ormskirk Advertiser did note that John, Mary and the surviving children were staying at that particular address with the Pope family. Besides John and Mary, the mourners included a Mr. J. Pope and Mr. R. Pope. Now, besides her father Robert, Mary also had brothers named Robert, James, John and Richard. It could have been any of those 5. Also present was Mr. Whalley and Miss M. Whalley. I think that could be Margaret's father Thomas and possibly her sister Catherine Mary, and they've got confused over the initials. And Our Lady's Church was filled with a sympathising congregation. Perhaps surprisingly to our modern sensibilities, each of the victims had a separate funeral service. Margaret Whalley was first, and Father Powell said of her that she had nobly done her duty and was faithful unto the end in loving protection of the child committed to her care. As we've seen, it was even to the point that she actually slept with baby William. Possibly he was in a crib, possibly he slept in her own bed. And to me that says she was probably William's nursemaid, or perhaps a general servant with particular responsibilities for the Liptrot children. She did, after all, have several younger siblings. And although her funeral service was said in English, the committal at the graveside was concluded in Latin. Afterwards, the mourners returned to the church gate, and now William Liptrot's funeral began. The ritual was repeated a 3rd time for his younger brother Richard and their nephew, Willie. The Ormskirk Advertiser reported that Father Powell and many of the spectators were moved to tears, and I totally understand that. Of Margaret's surviving relatives, her father Thomas moved in with his brother William, who was still alive, and there he assisted him at Littlemore Hall farm in Orton, which is not far from Lydiate, and then they moved to Walton in Liverpool. All 4 of Margaret's surviving siblings married. Catherine and William moved to Wallasey, they had their own families. Teresa married a motorcycle engineer and chauffeur. This is the infancy of motor vehicles, and they moved to live in New Brighton on the Wirral. Margaret's brother Thomas stayed local. He farmed in Halsall, he got married, and he actually lived to be 78 years old. Other than Margaret Whalley's father Thomas, who vanishes after 1911, I just cannot find him anywhere. I don't know what happened to him. What unites Margaret, Her mother, her brother Thomas, and the Liptrots, who were all caught up in that terrible night in April 1894, is that apparently they're all resting in the churchyard at Our Lady's in Lydiate.